This is Lecture 12 in the Western intellectual political tradition. I'd like to focus today on Hermann Hesse and Thomas Mann, theory and practice. I mentioned last week that Hermann Hesse, first of all, was a prolific writer, won the Nobel Prize for Literature as a result of a lifetime of political conscience, literary life, poetry, painting, and of course, in Europe at the time, being one of the leading doves when it come to World War I and then World War II as well, in questioning the aggressive nature of German nationalism. And much of his life writings and his life itself was at the forefront of these large political, intellectual, literary, religious questions of his time. Prolific writer, two of his works which really explored the dark side of what it means to be human, or the shadow, what Carl Jung would call the shadow side, are Steppenwolf, in which on the one hand he probes sort of the Lockean nature of the bourgeois person who wants to do well in the city, gets the education, gets a good job, has the possessions, life becomes predictable, and settle into security and predictability. That element of humanness, which is in one sense similar to what Tolkien was doing with the hobbits, they loved their shire, comforts, predictability, stability. On the other hand, the darker, the wild side of humans in Steppenwolf, Hesse's exploring as well. The person who doesn't fit into society, this ill at ease in the bourgeois middle class world, that is restless in such a world. It also has a dark and a destructive side. This also is played out in another one of Hesse's novels, Damien, in which you get the leading protagonist in that particular novel, ever probing shadow and darkness, pushing the edges. And so Hesse explores these elements of the human nature, which Plato essentially deals with: the dark or the light horse, who's driving the chariot, what voices do we listen to in that sense. And so a lot of Hesse's writings are really an exploration of what does it mean to be human, what is human nature, what do we choose to listen to, what wells do we drop our bucket in to slake our thirst for meaning and for purpose. But as I mentioned in a previous lecture, his great work, which built on Journey to the East, Narcissus and Goldmund, Siddhartha, many early works, was an exploration really of the tension in some ways between the life of the mind and the life of action. And within the Glass Bead Game, this came at a period in which culture had become fragmented, wars had decimated communities and people, intellectual life had become thin, and many of the publications and intellectual journals of the time were reactionary. People who seemed to be intellectuals were just dilettantes and voyeurs. No depth whatsoever, even though people would use the great names of the past. And so out of this emerged the Castalian, a group of intellectuals who, in the process, as they went to lower levels of school, were slowly weeded out, and the gifted, those who were curious, those who were committed, those who were disciplined, gradually rose the ranks in these particular schools, in which they were trying to reclaim, at the end of war and destruction, and the devastation of culture and of civilization and education and religion, to rebuild civilization and culture once again by drawing from all the great works of literature, music, culture, religion, politics of the past. Music became a key, a metaphor in the Glass Bead Game, in which the conductor, as it were, would bring together all the instruments, and as they played in harmony, the great beatific sound would emerge, which would draw people and evoke within them what it means to live the good, true, the beautiful life. And so these Castalians, in a sense, were the ones who went through years of training, of specialty, and then their discipline would work with other disciplines to create a unified and a symphonic whole of thought. Now, these intellectuals who were drawing together from the very noblest of the great cultures and civilizations of the West and of the East, from all religions, to create post-tragedy and devastation of a world gone amok, to rebuild out of the best that remained a new future, a better future, a fuller future. And the Castalians were the ones, like the guardian class in that sense of Plato's Republic. Many people will argue that Hesse's Glass Bead Game is really just a reworking of Plato's Republic in many ways. And the guardian class of the Republic really are just the Castalians of the Glass Bead Game, who are meant to guide the ship of state as the ship of the soul into the future, so it sails well across the turbulent waters of time, the unpredictable weather of time. And who are those women and men who have the gifts, the discipline, and have proved themselves over a period of time, a very fastidious study, immersion. And it was also, Glass Bead Game were about people who, the contemplative way of knowing, the meditative way of knowing, the mystical way of knowing, was the roots, in that sense, of which mind at its deepest was meant to be centered and still and receptive, a very different understanding of what we have come to know, certainly since the 16th century, of rationalism, in which reason is just something that is focused on an empirical way of knowing, or a mathematical or inductive or deductive way of knowing. In this classical sense, mind, or nous in that sense, is a contemplative faculty, which is not necessarily anti-scientific, but there's two sides to it. Just as there are two arms and two legs and two eyes, there is the mind is something that investigates, it's active, it goes out, and through thinking and interrogating and reflecting and analyzing, this is one, and dissecting. The other side of mind is a receptive faculty that's interested in synthesis and bringing together the various elements of thought, but also in terms of the individual, slowing down, being still, allowing silence and solitude to form, to forge, to remake, not necessarily remake, actually to discover who each is in their human journey and the relationship of that to community. So the Castalians were those that were engaged in, first of all, analyzing what does it mean to think, the role of the imagination, the role of the mind, and how does one live a life meaningful. That's the role of the will, so of the various faculties or organs of what it means to be human. It was an attempt to bring together a mature, a healthy whole personality within the context of community. Now, Magister Ludi, or Joseph Knecht, was the head. Over a period of time, he emerged as the head of the Castalians, and increasingly so, he was ill at ease as he rose the ranks within the Castalians about what he thought they were too detached, too isolated from the life of the hurly-burly of the valley, the life of action, the life of commitment to what goes on in the city. And one of the former students or friends of him, who had been trained as a Castalian but chose, in fact, to live as a politician or an activist in the valley, constantly challenged Magister Ludi. So what is the relationship between all your sophisticated thinking, drawing from the best of music, arts, culture, literature, philosophy, theology? What's the relation of these models of thought to life in the valley, and when you come down from the peaks of reflection and insight, how is that to be translated into the world of action and the unpredictability and power mongering of life in the valley? Eventually, Magister Ludi, or Joseph Knecht, accepts the challenge of his friend. He descends into the valley, and what Hesse is really grappling with is he's asked actually to train one of his friends. He's asked to train his son. And Joseph Knecht comes down, and he ends up, he thinks he's going to train this young person who will, in one sense, the ideal that this person will, in time, integrate thinking and action. For we know we can have thoughtful people who are paralyzed and impotent when it comes to action, and there are activists who are not very thoughtful, and they slip into very reactionary, intellectual, reductionistic intellectual positions. So the bigger question that gets raised, certainly in the Glass Bead Game, is what is the relationship towards meaningful thought, that leads to thoughtful action, and thoughtful action that doesn't shy away from thinking, but isn't sort of a mindless activism as well. Um, the Hesse in the Glass Bead Game certainly understood, given his European cult, his German and his European, and also his cosmopolitan way of looking at life, that in fact this world of thought uh, in time has to be engaged in action. And he saw and witnessed many intellectuals before World War I, throughout World War I, Depression years, World War II, who were always articulating what the good, the best New World could be. But when you translate that into action, it ended up in war and depression. And so the brittleness of thought when not engaged in action. And so the Glass Bead Game is an attempt to look at the relationship of the castellions of thought and action. In one sense, the novel ends with the sense of, can they be integrated in any significant way? Plato explores this in Gorgias and many of his other works as well, and it becomes an open-ended question for Hermann Hesse in the Glass Bead Game. The other great novel of the 20th century, both Germans, I mentioned it the other week, was Thomas Mann's The Magic Mountain. Magic Mountain is working on exactly the same themes as Hermann Hesse, the relationship of thought to action. The novel, it's a large novel similar to, it's a parable in many ways, a fairy story some would call it. Begins with Hans Castorp, who has, at one level, he's got an education, a technical education. He's an engineer. So we've looked at in the history of these courses the difference between techne and paideia as a way of knowing. Hans Castorp has a technical education, but totally unaware of the larger cultural, intellectual, political, economic issues that are going on in his time. So in that sense, his head is full of facts, but at a deeper level, he's totally unaware or uneducated or illiterate when it comes to the larger philosophical, political, economic issues surrounding him. The novel takes place just before World War I, and Hans Castorp, one of his friends, cousins, is in a sanatorium in a mountain up in Switzerland, being cured, so he hopes, of some illness. And as Hans goes to visit him, he thinks it's just for a couple of days. He ends up being there for 7 years. In fact, interesting, 7 is used because 7 is always a significant number in any literary tradition of going back to Genesis, span of time itself. 7th is always the beginning, the Sabbath and the beginning of something new. But Hans goes up. He discovers in this sanatorium a whole range of thinkers with different perspectives. There are people who are sensitive. They feel the issues very poignantly of their time, the tensions, the fragmentations between revolutionaries, philosophers, Marxists, religious people, all pulling in different directions to define what is the good life, what is the meaningful life. And just because a person has a technical education doesn't mean they have the smallest understanding of the larger issues that beset the humanities and culture and civilization. And eventually each person has to face into those culture wars, which each generation has. They may be different and but they lead to conflict and different interpretations of life itself. So Hans Castorp, for 7 years, lives up in this sanatorium, meeting with these different sort of intellectual positions. They all have their different names, but they reflect the different ideological understandings of the good life, the meaningful life, the beautiful life, the person who's committed to nature and very immersed in the dynamics of nature, those who are very leftist in their thinking, right-wing in their thinking, aestheticism, sensuality and sexuality, all these different perspectives Hans has to, and he grows up very quickly. So his real education of life and human identity and purpose and why we are here in our short journey through time, Hans is exposed to. He also faces into the darkness. One of the most powerful chapters is the Snowstorm Chapter, in which he enters into the darkness of a storm, and as it were, he's exposed to two elements of the classical tradition, the Apollonian, the harmony, the beauty of shape and form, but also the dark side of life, the destructive side that also the Greeks understood very, very well, the irrational side of Greek life. And so what Thomas Mann is doing, Friedrich Nietzsche factors very, very large in, just as he does in Hermann Hesse's The Glass Bead Game, so he does in Thomas Mann's The Magic Mountain. And so Hans Castorp, just like Magister Ludi, but in different ways, he encounters a variety of perspectives, pluralism on steroids. And for him as a young person, it was like, well, the big issue for him is, who do I believe and why, and what is the best interpretation that is worth living by? As he sits with each of these different worldviews, perspective embodied in different people. 7 years up, it's like the 7 days of creation in that sense. He inevitably has to go down the mountain. And he, as in going down the mountain, his cousin had gone down earlier. World War I is about to take place. His cousin is killed, and the novel ends with Hans Castorp. What is his future? So he's been immersed in the world of thought, just as the Castalians. He has seen and heard. Unlike the Glass Bead Game, which is looking at the harmony of thought, what Hans Castorp is engaged with is the sheer fragmentation, the pluralism, the diversity, the conflictual understandings of different reads of religion and politics and economics and nature worship, sensuality, sexuality, all these options. And he does not quite have the same ability as a Castalian to synthesize the best of them all, while recognizing there's mediocre ways of thinking, there's lower ways of thinking. And the novel ends with him going down the mountain, and as he hits the valley, it's the time of war. So what is Hans Castorp saying? Thomas Mann leaves that open. Now, both are large. Both are large tomes, novellas, but what is being explored is the relationship of thinking. Can thinking be synthesized into a unified whole? But what is the relationship between the best that has been thought and said in the world of action, or life in the valley? In Thomas Mann's the Magic Mountain, the issue is, of the many options in terms of theology, philosophy, politics, literature, sensuality, sexuality, is there a hierarchy, or are all just equal? Is it just we have a multiplicity of paths we can take, or none are any better than others? And then, given that, what then is the relationship of power in the valley, where you have states warring and people having to go to war? And again, the question is the relationship of thought to action. So Hermann Hesse, Glass Bead Game, Thomas Mann, The Magic Mountain, are both exploring in different ways the world of thought understood in different ways, whether it's contemplation or thought and grappling with ideas. But the relationship of the Castalians, or those who live in novels somehow set in Davos, Switzerland. I'm fortunate to live quite close to that place in the early 1970s. Quite a center, high up in the Alps, in the Alpine area. But what is the thought, what is the relationship of thinking to action? And Thomas Mann and Hermann Hesse are exploring this, and certainly at university, people are being trained to grapple with the world of thought, but what's the relationship of what they're learning either in disciplines or synthesizing in an interdisciplinary way the best of thought and its relationship to politics and economics and the hurly-burly of life in the valley itself. So theory and practice, contemplation and action, a couple of those large issues that anyone has to grapple with, not only at a personal level, but at a public level as well. Hesse and Mann explore this in these two significant tomes. Both men won the Nobel Prize for Literature at different periods of history, and these two large books reflect why that is the case as they deal with the large themes of life.